Assalamu alaikum everyone. We are back with another lecture. Last time we discussed about Renaissance literature. Today we are going to talk about Reformation literature. So before we begin, let me ask a simple question. How many of you have ever disagreed with the school rule or a government policy? I think we all have done that. Maybe you thought a uniform rule was too strict or a text too unfair. Do you ever speak or wish you could speak up and change the system? Well, in 16th century Europe, people were feeling the same way, but not about schools and governments. They were questioning the church, which at that time controlled not just religion, but also politics, education, and even daily life. Their protests led to what we now call the Reformation. It was re-changing the entire world in England. Now we will see how that massive religious shift influenced literature. But before we talk about that, let's see the historical background of the Reformation. The Reformation was a religious revolution that began in 1517 when a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses to a church door. These were essentially arguments against the practices of Catholic Church, especially the selling of indulgences, where people paid money to supposedly reduce time in purgatory. What was purgatory? It was basically a form of religious punishment where people who performed any sin were thrown. So you could cover up one sin with another sin. You could pay money to lower your sentence. So it is so problematic. Don't you see the problem over there? So the Reformation was not just about religion, it was about freedom of thought, the questioning of authority, and the spread of knowledge. It broke the monopoly of the church and gave ordinary people access to spiritual and intellectual life. And again, the printing press had a key role here. Martin Luther's writings spread rapidly because they could be printed in large numbers. Just as Twitter or TikTok today can spread a message across the world in hours, Luther's pamphlets traveled across Europe in weeks, sparkling debates everywhere. For England, the Reformation took on a political dimension. King Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church because the Pope refused to annul his previous marriage. This led to the creation of the Church of England. So, in England, the Reformation wasn't just religious, it was deeply tied to power, monarchy, and politics. Before we talk about the literature, you have to keep in mind one thing. It was because of Reformation that England had a dispute between two religious sects. First was Catholicism and the other was Protestantism. First, Catholics believed that the Holy Book was complete form of knowledge and the church was able to give them that knowledge. But the other group believed that everyone should have access to that book and have the ability and liberty to interpret it themselves for their own understanding. So, now let's come back to the literature of Reformation. Most literature in this time period was in Latin, because it was controlled by church and accessible only to the elite, because last time I told you that Latin was not the language of the common people. So for Reformation, writers began using the vernacular, the everyday language of ordinary people, which was English. This shift was revolutionary. It gave farmers, merchants, and common citizens access to knowledge and spirituality. Major change of this time period was also the emphasis on the Bible. Protestants insisted that everyone should be able to read the Bible directly without needing a priest to interpret it. This demand shaped not only religion but also language and literature. You can think about that debate similar to how we interpret the Quran. Some people say that religious scholars can interpret it, but others say that you have to understand the translation yourself to understand it. So that's the same debate that was going on regarding the Bible at that time. So now we will talk about the English Bible that was the first outcome of Reformation. It was the translation of the Bible into English, making it accessible for everyone, and the credit goes to William Tyndale, who was among the first to translate the Bible into English. For this, he was executed, he was punished. But his work influenced later translations. The most famous of these translations is King James Bible, which was published in 1611. For many, it is not just a religious text, it is one of the most beautiful works of English prose ever written. Phrases from the King James Bible have even entered everyday language today. For example, the powers that be. It's a phrase used for authority figures. Next phrase that is common, by the skin of your teeth. It means when you narrowly escape a problem. And third one, which is extremely common these days, the writing on the wall. It is basically an idiom that indicates an upcoming doom or misfortune. You can apply it to our current flood disaster. Despite all the precautions, we did not bother, and now we are stuck. These expressions are still used today, though in secular context. Imagine every time we use these phrases, we are quoting the Reformation era Bible. So do you see the impact? Bible also shaped English style, simple, rhythmic, and clear. Its language influenced writers from John Milton to T.S. Eliot and continues to echo in speeches and poetry worldwide. Now, let's come to the key writers of the Reformation era. The Reformation didn't just produce translations, it inspired debates, sermons, and even poetry. Let's look at some of those English writers connected to the movement. First is William Tyndale. We just mentioned his name. He was a scholar and a translator, determined to give English people a Bible they could read themselves. First, to translate the New Testament into English from Greek, mind you, not Latin, but Greek. His translations shaped the rhythm and vocabulary of English prose. About 80 to 90% of King James Version of the New Testament that is studied today came from Tyndale's work. Next is John Foxe. He was a Protestant historian. He wrote Acts and Monuments, popularly called Foxe's Book of Martyrs. Martyrs are people who died for a noble cause. Documented Protestant martyrs under Catholic persecution. It was extremely common at that time that Queen Mary I killed many people who believed in Protestantism, and she was labeled the Bloody Mary. And because of this, there were many English churches who talked about a nationalistic Protestant text, because there were not two sects divided. One were the old believers and the other was the new believers, and there was a clash between them. Next is Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer was the Archbishop of Canterbury, central figure in the English Reformation. He is also the author of the Book of the Common Prayer, which provided prayers in English instead of Latin. Writings emphasized clarity, rhythm, and simplicity, hallmarks of Reformation prose. Now, talking about his influence, the book's style shaped English ceremonial language, formal language. It even influenced writers like T.S. Eliot, and T.S. Eliot is one of the biggest names in modern literature. Next is Anne Askew. She was a noblewoman and a poet, one of the earliest English women writers to record her own religious experiences. Her examination, which was edited by John Bale, revealed her voice of courage and personal conviction. She influenced early female martyr writers. Her testimony gives us rare insight into women's role in the Reformation. Now, let's talk about the man who was the biggest writer of this time period, John Milton. Though slightly post-Reformation, deeply shaped by its ideas of freedom and individual consciousness, he wrote Paradise Lost, which is an epic poem about the fall of Satan and humankind. It explores themes of free will, obedience, rebellion, and divine justice. His most famous line is, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." Milton defended freedom of speech, arguing against censorship laws. We are still struggling with these laws, but he raised his voice. His influence and work combines Renaissance humanism with Reformation theology, making him one of the greatest poets in English literature. One thing to note was that many of these writers met a cruel fate, being accused of blasphemy, heresy, and many unjust prosecutions. Yet, they stood their ground for their beliefs, immortalized by history. They stood up for what they considered right, and they became famous. Now, before we move towards the next segment, let's have a little mind quiz again. Have you ever had a scenario where you thought something was restricted to only the elites, you could not have access to it, and the rest of the world could not have that education, like let's say Persian or Arabic texts? How different would our literary history be? If we could not translate our own holy book, how would we feel? The Reformation's shift to the common language is very similar to Urdu's rise as the language of poetry and culture in South Asia. Now, we have talked about the writers. Let's talk a little bit about the themes of Reformation literature. Let's quickly summarize the main themes of this era. First was religious reform, reforming people's religious beliefs. It was questioning traditional authority and how church was not the know-all, be-all. As individuals, as humans, you had the capacity to think, to use your brain. It also emphasized the access to knowledge, making all texts available to all. Now, next theme that it explored was the individual conscience, the idea that faith is personal and not controlled by institution. Sacrifice and martyrdom was also a main theme. Many writers faced persecution or death for their beliefs. These themes influenced not just theology, but also politics, identity, and literature in the centuries to come. Even today, we talk about that. Talking about today, let's discuss why the Reformation still matters. So, why should we, as Pakistani students, study this? Because the Reformation shows us how literature and language can empower ordinary people. Just as English Protestants demanded the Bible in their own language, today people demand knowledge in Urdu and regional languages so that education is accessible to all. The Reformation also reminds us of the risk of speaking truth to power. Writers like Tyndale and Askew gave their lives for what they wrote. It teaches us that literature is not just for entertainment, it is a tool of change, a weapon of reform, and a record of human courage and fortitude. So, let's close up our today's lecture. The Reformation was a movement of voices, voices that challenged, questioned, and inspired. Its literature opened doors to freedom of thought and expression. As we read Reformation texts today, we should remember that the ability to access knowledge in our own language and the freedom to think for ourselves are privileges bought with great struggle. Literature in this sense is not just history, it is liberation. And that's why it's extremely important to talk about Reformation and its impact. That is all for today, and see you next time. Allah Hafiz.